That's my first technical hitch of the night. Do you see that? Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on a beautiful snowy day in Vermont. Hold on one second. Can everyone hear me okay? Crucially, can everybody understand my accent? Is that okay? Yeah? Suffice to say, I don't have a particularly strong Scottish accent, but the quicker I go, the stronger it gets. So you'll just have to hang on to your seats, folks. Can everyone see the screen okay? So apologies tonight, there was a few technical problems. It would normally be in a giant screen behind me, so I'll be pointing at this quite a lot in the course of the presentation. So gardening on the edge is the title of the talk. The first thing I'd like to do, is there any chance, folks, we could dim these lights a little bit? Is that okay? So that people can see the screen. Yeah. Anyway, before I go any further, I just want to introduce you to my team and my colleagues. So as was just introduced to you, I look after Glasgow and West region. I'll show you that in a map in a little second. But the team here is a lady called Anne Steele. Anne is our head of policy at the National Trust for Scotland. From here on in, I'll just call it the Trust. It saves a few words. Behind Anne is myself, Colin Wren, who looks after Edinburgh Lothians in the east, Chris Wardle, who looks after Aberdeen and Angus. He's very fortunate because he gets all the castles. And then at the back there we have a chap called Tim who looks after Arran and Ayrshire. He also gets a couple of big castles on Brodick and Culzean. Brodick is one of the gardens I'm going to talk about tonight. So before I actually get to any of that, about any of the gardens I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a potted history about the National Trust for Scotland. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, other than to draw your attention to the fact that this is Pollock House, and the year in which the National Trust for Scotland came about, 1931. So it's quite an important time. And as was introduced to you just a second ago, I also worked at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. Now, in Scotland, the person, or the people, that designed the landscape of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland was a chap called Patrick Geddes, Professor Patrick Geddes. His nephew was a chap called Sir Frank Mears. Sir Frank Mears was also the secretary and the person that organised the signing of our constitution at the National Trust for Scotland, and a very important time in that period. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to just now, this is just the inception statement that was brought about by Sir John Maxwell at the time, and there's a word here that's called cabinet. Now, has anybody ever heard, this is quite informal, so please shout out, we can have a bit of conversation back and forward. Anyone heard of the expression cabinet of curiosity? Yeah? So in many ways, basically, for those that don't know, cabinets of curiosity is what people like Newton did. And as we began to understand our knowledge and develop more about the natural world in which we live, they collected things. They collected what's called artificialia, naturalia. And when they collected these things, they put them in cabinets. The cabinets expanded, became rooms, and therefore the natural evolution of these cabinets and the artifacts within them became what we have today, zoos, herbaria. Zoos maybe not, slightly different, but definitely herbaria, museums, places like the National Trust for Scotland in which we care for and look after many of these historic artifacts. So next couple of slides is not me saying what a large head I have, but I really just want to introduce you to a couple of things. So I had the great honour last year of being inducted into what's called the Incorporation of City Gardeners of Glasgow. And on this little crest here, there's words that you'll definitely not be able to read, and it says, gardening, the first of arts. Yeah, I like that. That's a good statement, isn't it? The first of arts. And this will become more clear as the presentation develops, because one of the gardens I'm going to speak about is Inverewe. And Osgood Mackenzie was the father of Inverewe and the person that started it all. And in one of his texts that he writes about is the art that is required in order to create a garden in such a barren wilderness. There's another very important thing about this, because this incorporation was developed purely to teach and to help people grow fruits and vegetables, because they understood 410 years ago that the diet of Glasgow was particularly bad. So that was a reason for bringing this about. This is the Royal Caledonian Horticultural Society's emblem. You can see it's got fruit and vegetables, another old organisation, 1809, so a couple of hundred years old. And again, this is an Edinburgh charity. This was brought about, its founding fathers were Andrew Duncan and Patrick Neal. These were physicians. Anybody that's been to Edinburgh before and has been to the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, there's a very fancy grand hall called the Caledonian Hall. That is the Callies' actual first home, and they bequeathed this home and the land to the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh from which to start their scientific endeavours in collecting plants from all around the world. But the most important thing about this charity is it's actually developed and brought about to teach people how to grow fruits and vegetables. So, on to the National Trust for Scotland. Can everyone see that okay? I'm sorry about this, but that is an image of Scotland, and on it is lots of little red dots. Those red dots represent the properties and gardens that the Trust looks after. Some facts for you. Suffice to say that it is actually the second largest landowner in Scotland. It is the #1 employer of gardeners in Scotland. Within these historic design landscapes, of which there are 38, there's over 100,000 cultivated plants and 15 different plant collections, 2 of which I look after. One of those is a Brigenia collection at Greenbank Garden in Glasgow, and the other one is the southern beech trees at Crowray Garden, and that's of the genus Nothofagus. There's lots of other things the Trust does. And some of those are the fact that we own 46 Munros, which are hills above a certain height, 400 islands, 1 World Heritage Site, 271 buildings, and 11,000 archaeological sites as well. So basically, the Trust looks after our heritage, our culture, and preserves it in a way that is fit for people of younger generations, future generations to enjoy. That all makes sense so far? Everybody with me? Good stuff. Okay, so for me, this is my patch. That little red arrow shows my patch. Inverview is up there, so it's quite a big distance. That's about 380 miles between the two. And I live in Fife, so my daily commute is 140 miles a day. But the good thing is that after the 70 miles of the day, I get to sit in a Georgian house. My office is in a Georgian house, and I look over a piece of landscape that's been gardened, cultivated, looked after, cared for the last 290 years, which is something really quite special, I think. So, just to share with you, I drive a lot in Scotland, as some of those gasps kind of twigged onto, but you see some beautiful, wonderful, weird things. I call this chap the Silver Man. There he is in a sunny day. Artwork in a landscape. What's not to like? I have about 80 photographs of this. The Silver Man is now gone. Who knows where he is? But he was there for a short period of time. I just wanted to share that with you tonight. So, gardening on the edge. It really is on the edge. It's on the edge of Scotland. So for those that are not very orientated with the world and how it's shaped, which I'm sure you all are, if you were to go 4,000 miles westwards, you'd hit Canada. If you were to go 4,500 south by southwest, you would be here. But these gardens, very much, you can see they're on the edge of the country. They are battered by coastal gales. Absolutely battered by it. But they are protected by the Gulf Stream. Now, each of these gardens has something quite unique to them in Scotland, and that is what's called shelter belt planting. Okay? Now, what shelter belt planting is basically a structure of plants that allows us to grow what we gardeners like to do. Can I have a quick show of hands? Who's all a gardener? Oh, that's good, excellent, good stuff. I don't have to convince you of anything then, that's very good. And what gardeners like to do, as you all know, we're actually a little bit control-ish. We like to control things, we like to get things growing in situations. We think, that's an alpine plant, but by golly, I'm going to plant it in my garden and it's not going to survive. But we just keep trying, don't we? That's what we do. So that's what these people did. That's what they did to bring these gardens to life. But actually, the bravery it took to plop 3 gardens on the west coast of Scotland with acidic soils, and in fact, soil depth normally about that much, took a bit of courage. And I'm going to explain that to you tonight, why they did it. So, the west of Scotland. You probably think you have this beautiful romantic thought in your mind, the west coast of Scotland, sunshine, everything else. I'm from a place called Fort William, which is there, and it rains all the time. And normally people say, oh, it's so beautiful in Scotland, isn't it? It's just lovely. It buckets down all the time. This is a place where I grew up. This is a beach called Camisdarach Beach. This is the island of Rum in the background there, the hills of Rum. But to be honest with you, it's more like that. It's just gales constantly. It buckets down all the time. And the west coast where I work is full of midges, and that's why I live in the east coast, because there's not much midges at all, and it's very dry. So, in this presentation, it does get a wee bit serious from time to time, so you have to forgive me, but it is going somewhere. I'm going to take you on a little journey. So often people will say, you know, we're experiencing climate change. Now, I'm not clever enough or scientific enough or brave enough to say we definitely are, but I am a gardener. And gardeners recognize things because we observe plants in the landscape. So I'm sure of certain things. But are we gardening in a changing climate? I think that's a fair enough thing to say. So I'm going to show you some photographs just now of plants, photographs taken last week in my garden in Fife. So this is an Iphion, spring flowering bulb, shouldn't be flowering just now, still flowering, keeps flowering. This is a Catenacci Caerulea, still flowering. This is a Lithodora diffusa compacta, still flowering. And this is Parahebe avalanche, still flowering. And this is Campanula, still flowering. They should have all gone over ages ago, but they're still keeping going because the climate is stretching the seasons. So one of the things I've observed over the years is when I worked at the zoo, Edinburgh Zoo, there was this tree called the southern beech tree, Nothofagus procera. And basically what I observed over a 5-year period, and this is all anecdotal stuff, no scientific evidence for this whatsoever, and that's okay, I think. What I observed was that the spring rains were about 3 or 4 weeks late for 5 years in a row. And what this did to this tree is it forced it into autumnal stress in the middle of summer. So in other words, it showed its fall colour. I didn't say autumn, I said fall. I hope you appreciate that. It went into its fall colour very, very quickly. And that's purely because as the tree is looking to pull water out the ground to get it going, to allow the sap to rise, it wasn't happening. So it conned its own self into going into autumnal stress quicker. Now what's the impact for a tree is it reduces its photosynthetic capabilities. So it's not very good for it. You all with me so far? Okay, grand, good stuff. Okay, so what I am sure of is this. You probably won't be able to see this very well, but this is an image of a dead albatross. Okay? Now this is a fact. Every single albatross on the planet that dies today dies with a belly full of plastic. Okay? You cannot get away from that. That is happening right now as we speak. Okay? Sea of plastic. This is a dead forest. So I was in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa in 2010. I was actually going on a scoping project to look for pheasants, actually, to look for a francolin pheasant. And what I was presented with was a dead forest. Now, the only reason that this forest was dead was what we would call either anthropomorphic, anthropogenic reasons. Human activities caused this. And the reason why this happened, this is in a mountain cloud forest species of Juniperus procera. And the reason why this happened was because the president of Djibouti decided to build a water pipeline from Djibouti city to his palace in the Foroudide, which is up a mountain. Okay, 500-kilometer pipeline. Now, the indigenous peoples of Djibouti are nomadic. So what happened was they stopped being so nomadic because they had access to water all the time. And therefore, what they did with their animals was they grazed the forest. What they used to do was graze the forest and come away again. So they would only visit it maybe 2 or 3 times a year. But they started to settle there. So that ruined the soil structure, compressed the soil, compacted the soil, killed the trees. Scotland is no exception to all of this. We still do things that are not the best practice. This is Pentland Hills at the back of Edinburgh, and this is peat bog cutting. What's the peat being used for? Horticulture, gardening. A dolphin swimming in a sea of plastic. Don't need to say any more about that. So I'm not trying to eulogize to you, I'm just stating some facts. The World Economic Forum in 2019, look at the risks that are written there. Extreme weather events, water crisis, climate change, adaptation failure, natural disasters, biodiversity loss. No politics, nothing. It's all the natural world, what's happening now that has the biggest impact upon us. So, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the National Trust for Scotland? What does it mean for all you good folks sitting in the audience that are gardeners today, and the ones that aren't? Well, for me, it's all about stewardship. You know, my job just now is not to create Simon Jones landscapes or to create a Simon Jones structure. It's far from it. My job just now is purely and simply to make sure that whatever I do and what my team does is to ensure the safety and the health and the welfare of our gardens so that future generations can enjoy them. It's really quite simple. So I'm not weird. These are my children. But when I am gardening, I'm thinking, okay, I've got to look them in the eyes because they come home from school and they're getting taught lots of different environmental things at the moment. They challenge me on waste and recycling and well, you're doing this wrong, Dad, and you're doing that wrong, Dad. So I've got to look them in the eyes and say, you need to do it this way. But I have to live that, walk that, breathe that, and do that talk as well. Okay, so that's my sort of lecture bit over, if you like. We're going to come to another point in a second, but just to introduce you to the actual gardens themselves. So from the bottom, we're going to go Brodach, Inverewe, and we're going to end with Arduni, and that's how you pronounce it. When I first went to Arduni, most people, like the lady that introduced me, sorry, you say Ardwain, and everybody does it. Everybody from Scotland says it as well. They go, oh, have you been to that place, Ardwain? And when I first went there was a local lady that said, where are you from, boy? And I said, Fort William. She went, oh, well, you have to say Arduni, because you have to sing it to people. So anyway, people from the Highlands apparently have very singy accents. There we go. Anyway, so this is the gardeners of Brodach. So for me, it's all about plants and people. This is a relationship that you will continually see for the rest of this presentation. You have no idea how many swear words I had to use in order to get all these dour gardeners from the west coast of Scotland to smile for this photograph. But suffice to say, it was a little blue in the air, shall we say. Anyway, so unfortunately, folks, you will not be able to read this, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of a potted history about the history of Brodach, and I'm not going to go into too much detail other than to draw some key names to you and bring those to your attention. The first thing I'd like to do is say in 1460, the Hamilton family acquired the island of Arran. There's two very, very influential people on the island, both ladies. The first was the good Duchess Anne, and this in 1632, her sort of jurisdiction on the island, basically what she did was to bring industry. The first teacher, she started salt mining, coal mining, she had the first school, the first doctor came basically because of her, so increased the standards of living. And between 1760 and 1810, a very important factor called Robert Brown planted tens of thousands of different species of trees with the hope and the promise that he would forest the island for timber production, for boat building, for all manner of different things. The other Duchess is in 1920 to 1957, and she's really the one that is, perhaps within the horticultural capacity, is the one that we all focus upon. And she was the Duchess of Montrose, and she brought about individual brilliant species of plants into the garden and took the walled garden from what was a tree nursery walled garden to something that was highly ornamental. A couple of other important names to draw your attention to are two plant collectors. One is George Forrest, and the other is Frank Kingdom Ward. And both of those plant collectors, actually, we still have plants that were their first collections are actually in those gardens today. So this is Brodach from Ayr. Apologies just now, these are not particularly clear for you, but they're just some historical images just to show you how the garden has evolved and changed over the years. The bottom one we have here is a sunken rose garden, and that is the work that is currently being renovated as we speak today. So that's the castle today. That's what we have in evidence. This is the walled garden today. This walled garden's from 1710 it was constructed. At the lower part of the wall has actually been renovated at the moment because with all these old walls, basically they create the exact conditions for little plants to come in, seed, get their feet held into it, get their roots into it, and basically they break open the old traditional lime mortar that was used. So Tim, my colleague, has the very an absolute honour, to be honest with you, because he's getting to replant this whole garden and reshape it and remodel the sunken rose garden. And just to share with you, it's not all about history, things are actually happening as we speak, but in terms of what plants can actually be grown in Brodach, everything that you see in this little border here is tender. And by that I mean in, forgive me because I don't know Fahrenheit, so I'm going to say Celsius. If anyone in the room can shout out just to help me, but none of them are hardly below freezing, to be honest with you. And an example of that just now is really this plant here, which is Dicksonia antarctica. Doesn't like the coastal conditions whatsoever, doesn't like the cold, doesn't like the snow getting in, freezing and breaking things open. Incidentally, if anybody reads any gardening books and it gives you a hardiness rating, it's often a frustration of mine, especially in the west coast of Scotland, because what they give you is a cold tolerance within the books. They never give you whether it can handle cold and wet, and that's often what kills a lot of plants, is actually cold and wet rather than just the cold. Some examples of the tender species of plants that are able to be grown in Brodick. Now, the only reason these are growing, if you remember I said a second ago, it is because of the shelter belt planting. So the shelter belt planting is basically normally native plants, sometimes willows, spruce, Norway spruce, Scots pine, things like that, and they're planted very densely in order to create the microclimate inside the garden that allows you to grow the tender plants. So these plants that are growing just now, none of these are hardy whatsoever. This is an Echium from the Mediterranean, so it's used to far warmer climates, thrives, does fine. This Rhododendron Johnstonianum was actually collected by Frank Kingdom Ward, not hardy, and this one here, the Genestrianum, is actually from Burma, a subtropical climate, but does very well in Brodick. So you can get from what I'm saying just now, it's actually a very mild climate in this particular part of Scotland. So the gardens of Inverewe. This is Osgood Mackenzie's garden. You can't see the faces here. This is a chap I'll just point out to you just now, a chap called Kevin Ball. He's been the head gardener there for the last 16 years. Very influential, very knowledgeable chap is Kevin, and does an excellent job there. So the people that I would like to draw your attention to just now in this part is really, there's one major person, and that is Osgood Mackenzie. Osgood had the privilege of being bought 12,000 acres of land by his mother, and off he went. He also had a big mansion bought and constructed by his mother as well. But the interesting thing is that Osgood stuck a willow in the ground, so the story goes, and off he went to create his garden. A lot of people thought he was mad, to be perfectly honest with you, because this is in Wester Ross, right in the north of Scotland. It's freezing cold, gets battered by those westerly gales, but he did it anyway. He had the fortitude and the foresight to say, this is a good place to grow plants. There is one thing I'm going to read out to you just now, and this is, he unfortunately died in 1922, and his daughter Mary took over, and I'm going to read out a little sentence that she said at the time of his death. So she said, "As best I could to cherish his wonderful collection and to augment it in the way I feel he would have done had he been alive." Had he been alive, to augment it as best he could. What was she meaning by that? What was she trying to tease out by saying something like that? And this is a really, really important point for National Trust properties, because when they get bequeathed to an organisation, we take it, but it tends to have an endowment that goes with it, normally quite a large sum of money, and then we start to work in it. Sometimes if it's a building, it'll have a conservation statement, more often than not, and that means that you have to preserve the building or the landscape in a certain way. Now what this doesn't mean, and this is where there's a general misinterpretation, it doesn't mean that we have to keep the garden looking exactly the same as it's always looked. It's a fatal mistake to make in any garden. Imagine if you tried to do that in your own gardens. All the mistakes that we make when we're gardening, all the things that we try and doesn't work, all the plants that we have to put in because we're responding to a changing climate. Yeah, it doesn't work. And often what happens in historic designed landscapes is that we don't chop things out, we don't thin it out, we don't chop trees down enough, we don't take out giant rhododendrons that are overgrown and leggy, and it creates a lot of problems. It creates a lot of pest and disease problems, and to be honest with you, you very quickly lose the aesthetic beauty of the garden if you don't take bold action. But she did. There's another name that I'd like to bring to your attention, and that is one James Arthur Campbell. He was the man that brought about our Dooney garden, which I'm going to speak about in a second, but he was also good pals with Osgood, and they did a lot of rhododendron work together. They were pals with Frank Kingdom Ward, and some of the rhododendron introductions you will find in each of these three gardens. Now, you've got some homework, folks. You don't have to take it away with you tonight. It's not actually homework. You've just got to remember one plant name, and that is Rhododendron arboreum subspecies Zeylanicum. So if anything, just remember Zeylanicum. Remember that for the next 20 minutes or so. So this is the Inverewe estate. It's a 2,000 acre estate that was bought. The garden is nowhere near 2,000 acres. If you just remember this little hook of a landscape here, and that's the hook, that's the garden. This is the house that was built. This is the walled garden, which I'll speak about in a minute. And there is Mary Sawyer, Osgood Mackenzie's daughter. Now, beside Mary Sawyer is a palm tree. And this is called Cordyline australis. I don't know if that's available in this part of eastern North America. But this is a plant that predominantly grows in Cornwall in the south of England. So that is a brilliant example of what the Gulf Stream does. It's had no protection whatsoever, but it grows and thrives perfectly well right on the coast of northwest Scotland. So Inverview, here's a few examples for you of the history of the actual house itself. So it was built 1865. The money was given to Osgood by his mother. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1914, and a new house was constructed. Again, Osgood's mother paid for this, and the Inverview house was built between 35 and 37, and that's what it looks like in 2018. So when I go to Inverview, folks, I get to stay in that little room there, which is quite nice, isn't it? It's really, underneath is a museum, and I get to stay in that very room up there, which is fantastic. And then when everybody goes home at night, the garden's all mine. It's wonderful, fantastic. Anyway, so Inverview walled garden itself, absolutely stunning. This is made out of Torridon sandstone. Probably like no other walled garden I've ever visited. And the reason is because it has everything grown in there. It's got fruits, vegetables, all sorts of ornamentals from all around the world. And one gardener looks after this. So whenever I meet her, she's like this, you know, I've had a hard day. I said, get on with it, you'll be fine, don't worry. And just to give you some images here, we've got, this is basically a South African bed. All the plants here are South African. You've got restios, crocosmia, azunes, all sorts of things in there. Just another example, agapanthus from South Africa. It actually has rhododendron ponticum. I don't know if you're aware of this plant, but in the UK, this is the bad rhododendron, if you like. This is the one that we're always trying to get rid of. Highly invasive, puts lots of toxins back into the soil, nothing grows around it, so it's incredibly bad as an invasive species for any of our native flora. But we're allowed, for historical reasons, to keep this one hedge, and all the other rhododendron ponticum's been removed over the last sort of 20, 30 years. Unfortunately, it's a beautiful plant. That's the trouble with it, but quite often in the Victorian times, they brought in quite a lot of beautiful plants, but unfortunately, not very well conceived because they didn't understand the invasive nature and tendencies of the plants. This is just an image just to highlight that or illustrate that point I was making a second ago, which is really, that's basically fruits and veg that are all grown within this walled garden. That's another angle of the walled garden. And I just wanted to highlight this last little bit to you. So remember I said the head gardener was called Kevin Ball. And quite often, we try and get across to our gardeners, you have to garden in the spirit of the garden. And what does that actually mean? So we try and garden not the way that they would have done 100 years ago, because times have changed, but actually you want to have that same spirit as what Osgood did when he rammed that willow into the ground and said, I'm going to create a garden here. And so what Kevin did was he designed himself gates and various different metal structures that hold interpretation panels and various other bits and bobs in the garden, and he did this like a willow tree. He also put in and worked in the shape of curlew birds, which is the bird that tends to you see on the coastal edges there. So another element or another example of using plants and people in the right places, and Kevin bringing that spirit of Inverview to life with every passing moment. The plants that were also planted there, I honestly can't believe this actually manages to grow. This is a Schefflerer from Vietnam, does perfectly well in in Inverview outside. This is a Cryphia murray from Tasmania. That's apparently a champion specimen and the best in Britain. Not my words, that was actually said by the RHS. And this is another New Zealand plant called Metrosideros umbellata, which doesn't like coastal conditions at all, but thrives because of this shelter belt planting. Also Willemi nobilis, which is the Willemi pine. Have you heard of this tree at all? This is one of those ones that's kind of like a dinosaur tree is what they call it, in the sense that it was thought to be extinct until a few years ago. So it's been on the planet for about 250 million years, and it has been recently rediscovered. Another one is the dawn redwood from China, Metasequoia glyptostroboides, which was brought back to life basically in 1948 when a botanist stumbled upon it. So this is not a fairly tender plant, fairly tender tree, and manages to do quite well in Inverview, again because of that shelter belt planting. So over to many folks' beloved Arduni, to our host here tonight. It's a very special place for him. So this is 22 acres of just heaven, just plant heaven. You cannot get a better garden than this. It is manned by 3 people, and it's 22 acres of incredibly complex horticulture. You just can't move for the amount of plants that are in there, but it suffers, and it suffers because it is overgrown. So a bit of a potted history of that. And basically the main character within this is James Arthur Campbell. Now the story goes that James and his lovely wife Ethel were sailing up and down the west coast of Scotland, looking for a piece of land in which to build their house. And they stumbled upon Arduni, which in Gaelic means headland, or green point is another translation of that. And he decided that that was the place he was going to build his house and develop his garden. So he's a good friend of Osgood Mackenzie. Remember that rhododendron species I asked you to remember? Okay, so it's in this garden as well, Zeylanicum. You've still got to remember it because I'm coming to an important point. But the other people that I'd like to introduce you to just now is the grandson of James Arthur Campbell, which is Major Ian Campbell, who took on ownership in 1935 to 45. During the war, the garden fell into a bit of disrepair. Fairly obviously why that would happen. But the other name to bring to attention, and moving on slightly in time, is in 1971 when the Wright brothers bought the garden. Now these were two Essex gardeners from the south of England. They bought it in 1971 and spent 12 years restoring the woodland and bringing it back to life, basically, because up until that point, the effects of the war and the economy of the time, it was just falling into a bit of disrepair. The most notable point for the trust point of view was in 1992, and that is when we acquired the actual garden itself, and Maurice Wilkins was appointed head gardener, and he remained head gardener there for some 25 years. Now, Maurice was a brilliant gardener, absolutely brilliant, a fantastic plantsman, but it became Maurice's garden, so it became a collection of his plants. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, to be honest with you, but it does create some issues. The other thing I'd like to point out here is in 2007, and this is going to be the tone for the rest of the presentation, is that the garden suffered its first outbreak of Phytophthora ramorum. Has everybody heard of sudden oak death? Yep, a few nodding heads. So this is it's not quite a fungus, it's a pseudofungus. It's not quite in that realm, but it was identified in 2007, and at that point our Forestry Commission Scotland is basically a sort of government appointed body that is charged with looking after Scotland's forests as well as creating commercial enterprises. So it gives people access to green spaces, but it also controls a forestry production. So that you've got to remember Phytophthora as well. Look, I'm getting you to work tonight and think of those two things, rhododendron subspecies Zeylanicum and Phytophthora ramorum. So this is Arduni, that's it there, a little bit of headland. Some other plants that grow quite well. You may recognize or know this plant, the Galenia. This is from northeastern USA. The other plants here to draw your attention to is a Metraria from Chile, a Crinodendron from Chile, and a Cornus from China. Cornus is completely hardy. I've seen that in a friend's house in New York the other day, but it doesn't like salty coastal conditions. So all of these plants will not do well on the coast, and the only reason they are doing well is because of the shelter belt planting that has existed to give that protection to everything else. So we're going to go on a little journey, a pictorial journey. So basically, I need to describe to you what it's like in Arduni. It's fairly overgrown, it's fairly dense, has an amazing plant collection, and you're quite contained. So when you walk into the garden, first of all, when you see it from the outside, it's just a bunch of trees. You can't tell there's even a garden there at all. But when you walk into it, all of a sudden you are presented with an absolute sight of beauty, to be honest with you. So as you walk through, you're heading towards the woodland garden. Lots of things here, like this little plant. It doesn't do very well in coastal conditions yet again, which is Fascicularia bicolor, which is a bromeliad, so it definitely doesn't like that snow getting in there, freezing. It would just die very quickly. So as you walk through, you're presented with a woodland. Woodland canopy is dominated by one species of tree, Japanese larch, Larix camphori. As you're meandering through the garden, what you eventually see is the sounds of Jura. So as you walk through this, you're heading through a woodland, you come out into a beautiful viewpoint, and the whole of the west coast of Scotland just opens up in front of you. Absolutely stunning. Hopefully I'm selling this really well for you tonight. I don't get paid for selling this really well for you tonight. I wish I did. So that's another image of the sounds of Jura and just some historical things for you to look at tonight. So I'm going to get a little bit serious again, folks, and this is with good reason, because our beloved Arduni garden is in serious trouble. And the reason why it's in serious trouble is the same reason why so many things and so many plant collections in so many countries' plant collections, indigenous plants, are all in trouble. And that is because of the amount of pathogens that they're having to fight against nowadays. So I'm not going to go through them all. We have a naughty list of plants in the UK. This is basically plants that we need to try and get rid of all the time. But I'm going to focus not on plants, but on pests and diseases. So we've suffered from Dutch elm disease for many, many years. There's almost no elms left at all in the UK. Ash dieback is something that's happening just now. Now, the reason why ash dieback is problematic is purely because of the movement of plants and people. It's because of the globalization in which we live in. I mean, how many times do you see things that have been shipped from the point of production to another point to be packed, to another point to be assembled, to be another point, another point, another point, and then it comes back to the place where it was from, and then we sell it? Yeah, that's what happens all the time. The whole world is kind of structured like that just now. However, this is a bit of a problem when you do that with plants. So the story behind our ash dieback was that the ash trees were taken to a port in Norwich, shipped off to Scandinavia, to be grown on a little bit in Scandinavia, to be brought back to be sold in Scotland, or in the UK actually. But they brought back the bacteria, and so all our ash are dying. So it's now illegal to sell any ash trees whatsoever in Britain. Some of the ones that we're facing with in my gardens, and I'm kind of known at the Trust at the moment as having the infected gardens. You'd be suffice to say I've not brought any infection with me. I cleaned my boots before I came here. But the one that's a bit of a problem for us just now is the golden root mealybug. Now, golden root mealybug is a New Zealand pest. It's just a little innocuous little yellow thing that eats roots, but it doesn't overwinter. Cold doesn't kill it. So basically, as long as it has roots, it keeps going. And it loves all roots. It's particularly fond of Mechanopsis. It's good in a salad plate for it. And it loves primulas. And I have that in Inverue, in Curray, and in Arduni. We also have a terrible cottony camellia scale problem. So a scale insect covers the whole plant, secondary infection, you get sooty mold all over it, reduces its photosynthetic capacity, slowly but surely kills the plants. New Zealand flatworm. Has anybody heard of that one, by the way? So the New Zealand flatworm in the UK is a real problem. So this is a almost carnivorous flatworm that eats our native worms. So if you take worms out of your soil, I'm sure you all understand quite clearly that if you've got no worms, then you tend to have really poor soil. You have poor soil structure. There are little engineers that burrow in through the soil. That's an issue for us. The most serious thing of all, though, and I almost cannot stress this enough, so it's highlighted, it's underlined, it's italicized, is a bacteria called Xylella fastidiosa. So this is a bacteria that came from Costa Rica. Its vector is insects, so it's insects that spread it. It's in decimating, absolutely decimating olive populations in Italy as we speak. And it's spreading, so it's in Belgium at the moment. It's also completely indiscriminate, like the golden root mealybug. It will destroy anything it comes into contact with. So it destroys vascular system of plants. It reduces the root's ability to take up nutrients and water. Now the scary thing about that bacteria is that if it's found, European legislation states just now that everything must die, everything, all vegetation must die within a 5-kilometer radius of an outbreak. Okay? Further than that, no plant movements at all within a 25-kilometer radius of that outbreak. Now, in northern Italy, they rely cooperative systems that they have for growing plants. That is their trade. In the UK, we rely on tourism, green tourism. There's lots of nursery trade. This has massive implications. It can also, it's not restricted to ornamental plants. It can go into the food crops. So just now, I know for a fact it's being monitored in America as we speak, because if that gets into our crops, then there's a food security issue as well as a biosecurity issue. Okay, so I'm sorry to get a little bit serious, but it's with good reason. And there is light at the end of this dark tunnel. So, going back to our Arduni garden, that is it. That's how you present. When you approach, you just see this innocuous little piece of land that sticks out and a bunch of trees. You have no idea what's inside the garden. Inside the garden, that's a lovely image of it. This is perhaps the image that I need to explain the most, because this shows and illustrates the good and the bad of the actual garden itself. So you can all see this sort of green blob of planting there. Folk at the back, see that? So the problem for the trust is that we own the garden, but we don't own any of the land around the garden. We don't own the path that leads into it, and we don't own the road that goes into it because of the way it was bequeathed to us. There was no endowment with the garden. The chief executive and the trust at the time thought we should just take this garden because it's a very important one. It has historical significance because of its plant collection and because of the people that brought it together. So, what this garden has had happen to it in recent times is that in 2007, sorry, these are the larch trees, I meant to point them out to you. So the actual whole woodland is dominated by Japanese larch. I said that a second ago, but just to reinforce that for you. They are huge trees. To give a good Scottish word, they're huge muckle trees. They're massive. They're 120 years old. And in 2007, we got our first outbreak of Phytophthora ramorum. Around that time, we were issued with what's called a statutory plant health notice. That is, a Forestry Commission of Scotland can issue a legally binding notice to tell us, anybody, to do something to the plant collection. So basically what they said is, chop all your trees down. We went, whoa, 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 whoa. This is an ornamental garden. We cannot do that. This is going to have devastating impact upon the garden. We need to think again. So for the years after 2007, leading up to quite recently, there was different iterations and a relationship built up between the Forestry Commission Scotland about what we're going to do with this pathogen. And they quickly understood, the Forestry Commission. I don't mean to paint them in a bad light, because they have a job to do, but they quickly understood that it's not as simple as going to a hillside that may be infected with this pathogen and taking all the trees down. That's a fairly simple operation, if you can imagine it. If you look at a hillside out of this building, if someone said chop all the trees down, you go in with a harvester, you chop all the trees down, you come out. But this has a rhododendron collection, this has a collection of plants that's of world renowned. So when I started with the Trust 2 years ago, I was handed a big stack of documents like this and the Statutory Plant Health Notice, the most recent one, that said you must chop down, as was said in the introduction, 885 of these mature Japanese larch. Okay, so hold that thought for a wee second. Now, the thing about Japanese larch are they are perfect to help the sporulation of this pathogen. Because they're deciduous trees, so they drop their needles, they can spread it quite well. Now, also within this garden, I've said there's rhododendrons, but I didn't quite realize how important the rhododendrons were, and I didn't quite realize how important they were to a whole variety of different people. So I was told that this is the second best rhododendron collection in Britain. There's nothing wrong with being second, you might say, but I thought, well, you know, whose is the first best rhododendron collection in Britain? There's a chap here standing on the right whose name's Peter Cox. Peter Cox is of the Glendoick nurseries. So his father, Ewan Cox, was a plant collector with Frank Kingdom Ward and was responsible for bringing in the rhododendron subspecies Zelanicum. Remember that? And I said to Peter, so if ours is the second best, then whose is the first? And he went, my dear boy, mine is the first. And that was that. So within this garden, we have very eminent people who are supporting us. And I'll just draw your attention to them. So Peter Cox, who's actually quite frail at the moment. We have Minette Struthers, who owns Armady Castle. We have Ian Sinclair, who is a rhododendron expert, worked in many of the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh's sites and satellite sites. And we have Dr. David Chamberlain, who's a taxonomic world authority in rhododendron and has spent his whole life studying them. So there's no pressure here to make sure that we do something properly. I'm not going to draw your attention to the facts at the top there, but I just wanted to give you some taxonomic information about the collection itself. Because if we've got 885 larch, which is a monoculture, in modern times, to me, that says risk. Yeah, the garden is at risk of something. You know, I've spelled out how many pathogens are attacking them. If I was to give you the proper list of pathogens that are attacking things in the morning, it would stretch all the way to the end of the room. However, of the 169 families represented, half of them are in the family Ericaceae, which rhododendrons are within. Of the 600 genera, half of them are rhododendrons. There's lots and lots represented within the garden. 95 geographical regions around the world are represented in 22 acres. That's quite a plant collection. But the amount of them that can act as vectors for the pathogen is as long as your arm. In fact, just about every plant in the garden is brilliant at spreading Phytophthora. So this is really just a little image here just to show you how it's affecting southwest Scotland. It's wind-borne and it can travel in the soil, leaf litter, in the water. It can, you know, it's quite clever. It can go anyway. Its vectors are numerous. What it looks like is basically you just get some needle drop and they go a little bit droopy. There's other tests that happen. It destroys the phloem, which is part of the vascular system of the tree, and you can quite clearly see any infected trees when they fly over it with drones. It's quite easy to spot. Unfortunately, Gregor and I, once you get your eye in, you begin to look at everything as if it's just about to get phytophthora. So it freaks you out, to be perfectly honest with you. And Gregor and I would spend many a morning at dusk looking for things. We say, it's in a spruce tree, it's in this tree, it's in that tree. Oh, it's just water stress, it's okay, don't worry about it. But it makes you panic, basically, about looking at all the different plants in the collection. So I think I've explained the role of the Forestry Commission to you. But it's not all rhododendrons in this garden. There are some other beautiful things, so I'll keep bringing this back to the surface, that it's not all doom and gloom. The Magnolia campbelli here comes from Himalayas, loves sheltered conditions, does not like coastal conditions at all, does well, as does the Lathrea, and as does this Asteranthera from Chile. That was also one of the plants that was brought by the good Duchess of Montrose to Brodick. Plants and people, making that connection yet again. This rhododendron, Cerimbarinum tamanense, doesn't like those conditions either. Neither do these two plants here, which is Acridenia and Eucryphea millingellii. So our situation is within the garden. And it's easy enough for me to explain this to you, but it's even easier if you see it in a pictorial reference. So this is a larch tree, and around the base of the larch tree are rhododendron stems. This is a larch tree, and wrapped around it are the stems of rhododendrons. So basically what happened was the rhododendrons have been planted, the larch have been planted all together, and they've all grown up together. So how on earth do I get 885 Japanese larch that are 120 years old out of that garden without damaging the rhododendrons and all those other beautiful plants that I told you about? So it made me scream a little bit. It made me feel like I was backed into a corner, and I really was backed into a corner. And one of the reasons I was backed into a corner is because all the documentation that I was given as I started had a whole plethora of different mechanisms for which to remove these trees. There was one business case that was for £5 million, and it was going to use a helicopter to lift individual trees out. There was another one that was horse and cart, and they were going to gently float them off to sea over a lovely period of time, and everything would be wonderful. But the critical point here, and this is where the pragmatic brain comes in and the penny-pinching brain comes in, is that at least in every single one of these documents, between 50 and 70% of the entire budget, technical hitch, folks. Between 50 and 70% of the entire budget was spent on outside contractors. And this does not sit well with me at all. I work for the National Trust for Scotland. It's the second biggest landowner. It's the #1 horticultural employer in Scotland. We must be able to fix this problem ourselves. And I kept banging that drum constantly. We have to be able to fix this. So there was a lot of scratching of chins about what to do. And the reason why we're all scratching our chins at this particular point, remember that rhododendron that I keep going on about, subspecies Zelanicum? There it is. That's it there. This scrawny looking, sooty mold covered individual plant is the most important plant within the garden. And we didn't know that. We knew we had it in the garden, but we didn't know how special it was. It was only because of that special advisory group made up of those 4 brilliant people that we knew how important it was. So that very plant was collected by Ewan Cox and Frank Kingdom Ward. So the scale of the task that we've got at hand, that's the garden. This little bit here is the lower garden, which is about 1 acre, and that is how many trees we have to chop down. So hopefully you can see from those 2 images that it's no mean feat whatsoever. The impact will be huge gaps in the canopy. That's larch trees there, that's a big spruce tree, that's a horticultural. Basically, it's just going to open up completely. Now, all the plants in the middle of the garden have all grown with that protection of the shelter belt. So they've got fairly natural growth forms. They don't look like they've been, exposed to the wind. There's no flexibility strategies going on within the structure of the actual branches themselves. They've not bent to the wind. They've just grown normally, as you would expect. However, we have a plan, he says. So you definitely won't be able to read any of the writing on that. That's a very boring chart. Up the top here we have the statutory plant health notice. So I have to do this. I have no choice whatsoever. It's got to be done. Because if we don't do it, what will happen is the Forestry Commission will just come in with a big harvester and they'll just rip the garden apart in order to get the trees out. And that will be it. There'll be nothing we can do about it. And I've had to say to the Forestry Commission, just stay over there for a wee bit and let me come up with a plan. So I had to write 7 different business cases. On the 7th one, it got approved. And then from that, I had to write many different project plans. And those project plans are ones that concern health, safety and environment, communications, operations, the heritage of the collection, the ecology of the site, engagement with people like you, and the facilities and infrastructure changes that would be required to remove these 885 trees. So this is the most driest part in the presentation, and I'm not going to read out this spreadsheet to you, but I will explain this very important point. So, from a health and safety point of view, you remember at the beginning, as I was introduced, he said he's a practitioner at the Institute of Environmental Assessment. So what this does is it gives me a dual skill set. I'm a gardener on one hand, and I'm an environmental manager on the other, okay? And those skill sets mesh quite nicely together. And they mesh nicely together perfectly for this project. So if you imagine somebody that has to climb a tree and sectional fell the tree, okay, that operation, so they chop it down into bits. So the use of a chainsaw and the climbing a tree is bound by health and safety legislation. The refueling of the chainsaw and the spillage of the fuel and the fumes that come out of the back of the chainsaw are bound by environmental legislation. Now, quite often in the UK and Europe, they sit like this, apart from each other. And that doesn't sit well with me at all. So what I did was I documented and detailed every single possible conceivable thing that we have to do in this project from a health and safety capacity and an environmental capacity, and I documented it and I linked it to a legal register. Now what this means is that everything is covered. So if I get challenged in any way, shape or form, because what we have to do with the trees is when they get chopped down, if there's any brash or stems, we have to burn them to conform to the statutory plant health notice. But when you burn them, that emits dark smoke. And dark smoke in common law is something that doesn't happen all the time, so the local people could quite rightly complain, and maybe we could go to court. But if I get my act together, and I get all these different activities written down, and I link it to a legal register, what it means that we're considering everything. So we're doing everything we possibly can to mitigate our environmental impact by felling all these trees. Okay? Everyone got that? Excellent. So the other thing, or the best way to describe that, is I created an aspects and impacts register. And basically, an aspect is an activity. It has a cause or a relationship. And then it has an impact, and that impact can be positive or negative, and it doesn't really matter which. It's the fact that you've considered it, you've thought about it, and you've created actions to mitigate it. There was a communications plan. So I have spoken to everybody and their granny about Arduni. I've done it to village halls with one poor old lady that turned up, and I had to give a presentation to one person. Suffice to say, she got a very thorough presentation that night, and it went down well. But local stakeholder groups, the local businesses, anybody and everybody, that's the purpose of this. We can't hide from this. We can't hide from the fact that this historic designed landscape is going to have its trees chopped down. What we have to do is get everybody involved and get everybody to go on this journey with us. At least that's what I think should happen. So the exciting bit for the gardeners, or the exciting bit for the trust, remember I said 57%, something like that, was going to outside contractors. So this project's going to be delivered, we're already 2 years into it, is going to be delivered for £243,000. We're using no contractors whatsoever. We're going to fix it all ourselves. And the way that we're going to chop all the trees down is because we're going to use the arborists from Mar Lodge Estate, and they come over once a month for a week, and they do some felling, and then we're going to mill it. And we're going to mill it using this wood miser mill. The reason why we're milling it is because if we don't mill it and we take all this timber off site, then there's another chunk of legislation that I have to conform with. And that is I need a processing license, and I need a movement license, and then I need to sterilize every piece of equipment as it leaves the garden. However, there's a little caveat within the statutory plant health notice that states if you mill the timber and you create it into a situation that is square-edged milled timber, then it's not infected anymore. So the implications of this for the National Trust for Scotland are fantastic, because what that gives us is access to 40,000 tonnes worth of timber. So if you can imagine all these gardens, all these properties that need dahlia stakes, deer stalk fence posts, cladding for buildings, all sorts of different things, they're going to get it from perhaps some of the nicest timber you can possibly get. So you can see that we're trying to twist this around, these negative situations, into one of positivity for the Trust. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to mill it, and we've started doing that just now. So all the new interpretation panels, all the edging is all getting done with Japanese larch. And it is a beautiful coloured wood. It's red when it gets cut, and it stains to a lovely sort of grey colour as it moves through time. So in order to get that to happen, we designed a little order form that got emailed out to everybody in the Trust, and the email does back, it goes to the head gardener, and they just wait their turn. So we get round of all the legislative issues that we have because the timber can go off. Now there was a question put to me the other night and says, but isn't that timber still infected? Well, it might have spores on it from the pathogen, but the whole garden is full of it. It lives in the leaf litter, the soil, everywhere. So we're not going to get rid of Phytophthora ramorum. It's there forever. So the only thing we have to do is give that a wee spray with a chemical called Clean Kill as it leaves the garden, and that'll kill the surface spores, which is exactly what you do for biosecurity measures when you visit different Scottish gardens. You go in a foot bath, and that takes off the surface spores off. The problems with things like foot baths is that it doesn't take the mud off your feet, and the mud is actually, there'll be spores inside it as well. But it's good that visitors actually see that we're paying attention to the fact that we actually have this serious infection within the garden. There's infrastructure changes going on throughout the garden. So we've had to widen, we've had to take bits of historic lawn away, we've had to chop the odd thing here and there away, and we've had to put down Type 1 hardcore in order to take the big muckle tractor all through the garden. Now, the people that are supporting us are obviously saying, well, what are you going to do with the rhododendrons? Because a lot of them are going to be damaged. There's no two ways about it, folks. Plants will be destroyed in this activity. So we've got a relationship with the college called Duchy College, and a wonderful lady called Ros Smith is actually going to do what's called micropropagation. And micropropagation is basically you send off stems of rhododendrons about yay big with a tight floral bud, 2 auxiliary leaves. We're allowed to post them to her. The government legislation says we can do that. And then what we get in return is little baby rhododendrons that have been grown in a lab that are clean, uninfected, and it means that we conserve that genetic stock. So remember that rhododendron again? I keep going on about that one, the subspecies Zelanicum. Good on you. Thank you. 10 points to you. Then we get to keep that plant because it will be genetically identical to the one that had that historical and cultural significance in terms of its plant collection. It doesn't stop there. We have to be mindful of the ecology of the site. Again, this goes back to the aspects and impacts register. What if somebody comes along and says, yeah, what are you doing about red squirrels? That's a protected species in Scotland. What activities have you done to make sure that your activities are not harming this particular animal? So we work with an ecologist, Parnassus Ecology. They set up camera traps. We found red squirrels. We found drays. We found bat roosts. A whole number of things. So on day 1 of felling was actually a problematic tree, and it had a bat roost in it. So the ecologist came with us, and we were thinking, you know, this is £500 a day for this person. He did the report for us. He told us exactly what was going on in our site, and we thought, you know, I wonder what he's going to do. You know, what does an ecologist do when you've got a bat roost? So he comes on day 1. And we're thinking, all right, okay, here we go. He's going to get rid of the bat roost. What's he going to do? So he gets out an enormous stick and shakes the tree. And that's all he did. And the bat disappeared. Who'd have thought that that's what they do to get rid of bat roosts? And that conformed to all the legislation. And so we were okay. We were covered there. But actually, I'm being flippant about it. Lindsay's a great guy, and he's with us. You know, he's always on the end of the phone. We tell him exactly what we're doing at different states. And whenever we tackle, these little dots here represent squirrel drays or bat roosts. Whenever we tackle any of those trees, it's all documented. It's filed within that giant spreadsheet. Those documents link to all the legal stuff. So I know that we're doing everything absolutely right. Because remember, folks, one of the things I have to do is look after 12 gardens in my region, and in Inverewe as well, which is a special advisor to to that. So the only way I'm going to travel this much and do it is to have systems like this to make sure I know that all the gardeners are doing their jobs properly. That make sense? So, just to finish off, there's one other very important thing here, and that is, in a part of the garden, we discovered this wooden structure, which is basically what's called lath. A lot of buildings in the UK are built what's called lath and plaster, which is wood, and then they put on plaster. That's how they used to build them. They stopped doing it now. And we tried to date this, and we spoke to Anne Steele, our head of policy. She says it's about 26 years old. So that's great, isn't it? 26 years old, still standing, but there's a plant growing right next to it here, and this is Rhododendron protistum. Does not like coastal conditions at all. The sea is about 20 yards beyond this windbreak, and it's thriving and it's flowering. So that gave me a little bit of confidence. That began to make me think, what can we do here? So this is the Firth of Forth in the east coast of Scotland. This is the Forth Rail Bridge. This is the old Forth Road Bridge. This is the new Forth Crossing Bridge. I live there. And that is the windbreak that was designed for the new Forth Crossing. Now this windbreak has been designed so that a car can travel at 70 miles an hour and a force 8 gale over the bridge. Yeah? Up until that point, the old Forth Crossing, you could go and they would shut the bridge. It was just getting shut all the time. It was a nightmare for commuting. But now that this is up, we can travel quite quickly over it. Now you see the design of this. Basically, it's upright stanchions and sort of straps of plastic fixed between the two upright poles. Yeah? Really, really simple. And that's what we're going to do in Arduni. But instead of using metal and plastic, we're going to use the larch to our advantage. So the Forestry Commission Scotland have allowed me to keep dead standing poles between 1.5 and 2 metres along the horizon of the garden. Okay, so this won't be a fence because it'll move with the organic shape in which the trees were planted. But we're going to leave the dead standing poles, we're going to use our mill to mill the timber, and then using no nails and no metal fixings so that we reduce and keep reducing our environmental impact, we're going to use colleges, Historic Environment Scotland, craft skills, carpenters, and they're going to fix the boards and planks that we mill into the sides of the poles, thereby creating our own organic windbreak. That will last for about 10 years, and in that time we will be able to plant up on the inside and the outside of the windbreak. That will give the time for those plants to mature and provide the wind cover that the rest of the plant collection needs inside the garden. So to give you a little bit of other information about a windbreak, so if I'm a windbreak, all 2 metres of me, thanks. I'm not that tall. If only I was 2 metres tall. Anyway, my height, so basically how it works, if you have a windbreak that's my height, you will get a 50% reduction in the force of the wind for 10 times my height and distance. That make sense? So basically, when we've calculated this at between 1.5 and 2 metres, and we can get that diffused wind through the garden, what that's going to do is give all the other plants the protection they need. So the trees that are grown with a more natural growth form will not be exposed to the force of the Atlantic gales in the way that they would be normally. So there's lots of positive outcomes. I'm not going to read them out to you just now. I think I've explained that to you. But ultimately, we're going to have a more resilient garden. Now there's one critical thing I've not talked about, and that is what you're going to plant it up with afterwards. So we had a monoculture of Japanese larch. But now what we're going to try and do is have as many different plant species as possible. We're going to create an arboretum. And these are all graded, and we have different criteria here. So we're looking at invasive tendencies, whether it's susceptible to other pests and diseases, home for squirrels, damp areas, tolerance, all different things, and we give them a rating. So this list is massive. It goes on for ages. And that will allow us to curate different plants and bring them into the collection. However, it also creates an opportunity. It creates a brilliant opportunity for the gardeners, because in this historic design piece of landscape that's been about for 130 odd years, they're going to be the gardeners. Okay, they're going to chop down the trees, but they're going to be the gardeners to recreate an arboretum for the future generations to enjoy, to safeguard this historic heritage piece of landscape. But it also creates another opportunity. And this, folks, is another incredibly important point, because what I like to do is to try and show our gardens in a way that makes them more than the sum of their parts. In other words, explain to people all the different complicated parts within a designed landscape. That's not just about the aesthetic beauty of the plants, it's so much more than that. So is there an opportunity for us, remember when I showed you those images of the plastic and the dolphin and all sorts of different things, can we do something about that in a slightly different way? Well, we know that the islands of the world, especially all around the world, are the ecosystems that are the most under threat. They're right on the edge, a little bit like these gardens. So is there an opportunity for us to look at the temperate islands of the world and begin to curate and bring in the hardy plants that could grow in this here garden? Well, of course there is. And this plant typifies it beautifully. This grows off the coast of California. Catalina ironwood tree in the Catalina Islands is as hardy as they come. Grows in Edinburgh, grows on the west coast of Scotland. I've grown it myself, it flowers, it works. So the answer to that is yes. This is an IUCN red-listed plant, and therefore it is under threat as we speak. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't bring that into the collection and grow it in our dúine. So it is happening, I promise you. I'm not just talking a load of rubbish, it's really happening right now as we speak. These are the Mar Lodge arborists looking all manly and strong. This is them up a tree, and that puts it into perspective. There's a tiny wee man up a massive tree, and that's him section felling it. So really, when I'm doing the bulk of this presentation to you good folks, to anybody that will listen, to be honest with you, it's really just to say, it's okay. We've got a lot of problems to overcome. We're not alone in this. I was at New York Botanic Garden the other day, spoke to the head of horticulture. They have exactly the same issues, albeit in a slightly different situation. But it's really just to say that the trust is in good hands because we've got some good people backing us up continuously. And that is me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Questions?